Welcome back to Fast Gadgets. Tonight we're going to talk about Linux in the news, and I wanted to start with something that I really haven't seen much about in the news, which kind of surprised me considering its importance, in my opinion, as a milestone, and that was Linux being 25 years old today. Actually, it isn't today. It was based on August 25th, my mistake. But hard to imagine that Linux has been around for 25 years. And I think back to my experiences with Linux. I originally got started professionally in the IT world in 1994, working for a freight auditing company. And at the time, this particular company used IBM mainframes, AS400s, PCs with Windows on them, but there was no Linux there. And I actually remember getting my first job in 1997. I started working for a county library system that was part of a consortium of library systems. There were 2 county library systems and 3 colleges. And back in 97, I would go to the different libraries and set up all the personal computers for staff and for the public. And it was then, when I was at one of the colleges working with their IT staff, that I got the chance to actually see my first Linux machine. And this would have been, 97, I would say. And I remember that the IT guy that had set it up, he was able to get Linux to boot up, but if he clicked anything, it would crash immediately. So there was definitely some work to be done. It wasn't ready for prime time in any way. And then I think if you fast forward in my career a bit, in 2000, by that time we had a Linux file server, we had a Linux firewall, most importantly, and we were actually using the firewall to do routing between different networks as well. Eventually I became a director of the consortium, and back in the 90s, in 97 in the consortium, we probably had, I would say, 95% Windows computers, and we had maybe 1 or 2 Unix computers, and then in 97 we got 1 or 2 Linux computers, and we had a total of 5 physical machines. And in the mid 2000s we purchased a couple different hardware platforms, a couple different servers, and we put ESXi on them, and from that point on almost every server we built would be a Linux server, unless for whatever reason the vendor required us to support Windows. So every once in a while we might have a vendor that had an application that basically would only run under the Windows NT operating system, which was fine. But overall, over the years, all of the Windows NT servers, with the sole exception of those few that needed to support Windows NT apps or applications that required Windows NT, everything else became Linux or Unix. And even Unix was phased out after a while. Our primary database server originally was a Unix system. We had an HP UX originally in the mid 90s, and I recall that system, my boss at the time was saying it cost about $150,000. And fast forward to 2009, and we replaced that, actually a newer system than that one, which was also a Unix system, we replaced for 17 grand, and we had a 4 processor system with, trying to remember, 6 cores each. 24 cores. It was a Sun system, and it had, of all things, 20 SAS hard drives in it, and it came with 32 gigs RAM, but we put in 256 gigabytes RAM because we turned it into a system that we would use solely for ESXi virtualization, so we could run virtual machines on top of it. And with that system, our Linux systems expanded so fast. We had, last count, about 80 Linux-based systems that would do a variety of different things depending on what the need was. So in one example, we set up a server with Lime Survey so that we could run surveys in-house instead of having to hire a company to do it or to pay. Yes, there were free survey tools, and there still are, but they always had limits because they were trying to get you to buy a more expensive package. So, it was easier for us to roll our own, so to speak, and build it on a Linux server. In 2006, I switched to Linux as my primary operating system, which was totally awesome. I went with Fedora at the time. And ever since then, I've always had, for the most part, Linux as my primary operating system. I usually do virtual machines with VirtualBox, so that if I have a Windows need, I can run it in VirtualBox. But overall, it's been Linux the majority of the time. I do spend a little bit of time when a new operating system comes out and learn it. So on the Lenovo Yoga 2 Pro it originally came with Windows 8. So I took a little time to learn Windows 8 and 8.1, even if I didn't like it that much. Eventually it was upgraded to Windows 10. So I took the time to learn everything I could about Windows 10 so that I would have experience with it in case I had to support it. And eventually I just took the whole thing, cleared the hard drive, and put Fedora back on it. And then I created a virtual machine for the very few things that I need to do with Windows 10. So I think about all the experiences I've had with Linux and how it's worked so well for us in an IT setting, and how it slowly but surely took over the server market. And quite frankly, it's been great. I can't believe this picture of Linus. He looks so young. There was the original proposal for assistance. Slackware, which is a very old distribution. It's one of what I like to call the source distributions. Red Hat is another one. Found it funny that Steve Ballmer called Linux a cancer. And you fast forward and look at Windows 10 today, and it has the Linux bash shell built in. So much has changed. Android was probably one of the biggest supporters of Linux, but in reality, it's the kernel that's Linux. Much of it is proprietary code. I say proprietary, but for the most part, even with Android, there's a big chunk of it that's open source. And then Google's done a pretty good job of keeping the apps truly proprietary. So Android, the operating system, is open source, but many of the applets, the apps, they've been changing slowly so that they're no longer open source. Very clever. Red Hat became the first open source company to reach $1 billion in revenue in 2012, and it's incredible to think that what they offer is open source, but you have to remember that what they're really offering on top of that is services, and that's really what you pay for. And of course, Microsoft and Linux becomes best friends, so to speak, in a way. I still wonder why Microsoft did it. I want to say they realized the need for it, but I'm not so sure. And I'm still really skeptical that it's going to continue. We'll see how it goes. Distribution rankings. Interesting list of distros here. It's got Mint on top as number 1. Fedora is down there number 6. Still my favorite, even so. And yeah, I have to agree, the world really is Linux powered. You think of all the server applications that we have for Linux and how it expanded in the server market to literally take over. Appliances that use Linux, our phones. It's just amazing to me in 25 years what Linux has become. Absolutely amazing. So let's move on in the news. A couple other things I wanted to talk about. we talk a lot about security. My background really is in security and networking, so I always like to talk about security. And I realize this is Apple, but just kind of driving home the point that it really doesn't necessarily matter what operating system you're on. There's still going to be vulnerabilities. And Apple recently fixed 3 zero-day exploits that were targeted attacks. And there was an activist who was living in the UAE, and he received texts that were going to supposedly give him information that would help with his research, and he was highly skeptical, so he sent it to the Citizens Lab researchers, which is a group that looks at different exploits, and they evaluated it and found out that it was indeed an exploit, and it was connected to the NSO group, which is based in Israel, of all places. Now they're saying it is exclusive. It's a government exclusive, so apparently, I don't know if the government uses it or not, but very interesting. A lawful intercept spyware product. So you do have to think that it doesn't really matter which operating system you're on. Now this is particularly for iOS. It's not for macOS, but even so, with Android, there's many vulnerabilities that concern me. The biggest risk to me is the fact that Android phones can't get updated as readily as Apple phones can get updated. Linus Torvalds admits and talks about how GPL was a defining factor in the success of Linux, and I would have to agree. Although it's interesting, there are companies out there that do tend to take advantage of open source in the way that they will alter the code, then they won't make that particular altered code available. And some of these companies basically out and out are saying, you know what, if you're so concerned about it, you can sue us and try to get us to give you the code. And that's really still a problem. It comes down to the deepest pockets kind of thing. And if I'm not mistaken, EFF recently sued a company and they were not successful. So I don't know if they're going to try again or what's going to happen, but it's an issue. It really is. I don't know if anybody's tried ReactOS. I have tried it, but it's been quite a while. The last time I tried it, it was so buggy it was hardly even worth trying. But they're saying now that ReactOS has some pretty significant updates. It now supports. They're now saying ReactOS supports the Linux file system, and supposedly there's more game support for it as well. So fairly interesting. I like the fact that ReactOS basically is a byte for byte, bit for bit code emulation, or I won't say copy because copy is not correct, but it tries to emulate and do everything the NT OS kernel does so that you can run Windows programs on it. And that's what makes it really interesting. And last, I don't know how many of you out there are Ubuntu users, and if you've tried to download 16.10 Yakety Yak, Beta 1's available. And if you have, drop some comments, let me know how it's worked for you. I am curious to see if there have been updates, and if so, what the updates are and how it's changed for you. Now here's something I found kind of odd. So they released basically a beta of Ubuntu, GNOME, Kylan Mate Studio. They do not release a Unity beta. I wonder why that is. You would think they would want to have the Unity beta of all of them tested, but there is no beta yet. Anyway, very curious to see what you've discovered, if you've checked it out. If you've not, let me know if you're interested. I might do a video on the beta. So that's Linux in the news for this week. Hope you enjoyed, and I hope I'll see you next time. Thank you very much. If you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe.